The 19-year-old girl who had crowned a king now stood chained to a wooden stake in the old marketplace of Rouen, about to be consumed by fire. Her wrists bore the marks of months in chains, her body weakened by imprisonment in a damp cell, where 3 English guards watched her every movement, even as she slept. The woman who had led armies and broken the siege of Orléans would die not on a battlefield with a sword in her hand, but bound and helpless before a crowd of 10,000 spectators who had come to watch her burn. May 30th, 1431. The morning air in Rouen carried the smell of the wood that had been stacked around the platform, dry timber chosen specifically for how quickly and intensely it would burn. Joan had been brought from her cell in the castle before dawn, given one last chance to confess her supposed sins. She had refused. She wore a long white shift, the garment of penitence and execution, marked with the word heretic for all to see. Her hair, which she had kept short in the military fashion that scandalized the church authorities, was barely visible beneath the tall paper cap they had placed on her head, inscribed with the words heretic, relapse, apostate, idolater. The journey from cell to stake had taken less than an hour, but for Joan it must have felt like descending into hell itself. She was 19 years old. At 13 she had first heard the voices, St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, who told her she would save France from English occupation during the 100 Years' War. At 17 she had convinced the Dauphin Charles to give her command of his army. At 18, she had lifted the siege of Orléans in 9 days, a military victory that changed the course of the war. At 19, she would die in flames. The trial that condemned her had been a masterpiece of legal manipulation, a trap constructed over months with such precision that escape was impossible. It began on January 9, 1431, when Joan was brought before a tribunal of pro-English French clerics in Rouen. She faced 70 charges initially: heresy, witchcraft, idolatry, invoking demons, all stemming from the voices she claimed to hear and her insistence on wearing men's military clothing. The judges were led by Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man who owed his position and wealth to English patronage and who was determined to destroy the girl who had humiliated English forces. For months, Joan defended herself with an intelligence that astonished even her accusers. When they asked her if she was in God's grace, a theological trap question that could not be answered safely either way, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The answer was so theologically sound that even the hostile tribunal had to move on. When they pressed her about her voices and whether she would submit to the church's judgment, she insisted that her voices came from God and that she could not renounce them without lying. The interrogators worked in rotating teams, questioning her for hours each day while she remained chained in her cell, denied access to the sacraments without legal counsel, threatened with torture. The 70 charges were eventually reduced to 12, but the outcome was never in doubt. This was not a trial seeking truth. It was a political execution wearing the robes of ecclesiastical justice. The English, who had paid 10,000 francs to the Burgundians who captured Joan at Compiègne in May 1430, needed her discredited. If she were simply a military prisoner, she could be ransomed or exchanged. But if she were a heretic, a witch, a servant of the devil, then everything she had accomplished, the victories, the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, the renewed French resistance, could be cast as demonic deception. Burning Joan would not just kill her, it would attempt to erase the legitimacy of the French cause itself. On May 24, 1431, 6 days before her execution, Joan experienced what must have seemed like salvation. She was taken to a scaffold erected in the cemetery of St. Ouen Church and told that unless she signed a document abjuring her visions and promising to stop wearing men's clothing, she would be burned immediately. The crowd was assembled. The executioner stood ready. Joan, faced with the immediate prospect of the flames, broke. She signed the abjuration document, renounced her voices, and agreed to wear women's clothing. It was a trap. The document she signed contained provisions that virtually guaranteed she would violate its terms. Back in her cell, Joan was given women's clothing to wear, a dress that left her vulnerable in a prison cell with male guards. Within days, something happened that the tribunal either orchestrated or exploited with cold calculation. Joan said someone attempted to rape her in her cell. She put men's clothing back on to protect herself, to have something she could tie shut, to have layers that might deter her attackers. When her jailers found her wearing men's clothing again, they reported it immediately to the tribunal. On May 28th, 2 days after resuming male dress, Joan was questioned again. She admitted that her voices had returned, that they had told her she had made a terrible mistake in abjuring, that she had damned herself to save her life. To the tribunal, this was perfect. She had relapsed into heresy. Under canon law, only those who had abjured their heresy and then returned to it could be sentenced to death by burning. The abjuration had not been her salvation. It had been the legal mechanism required to execute her. The Bishop of Beauvais pronounced the final sentence. "We excommunicate and reject you, Joan, as a rotten member which taints and contaminates the body. We cast you out of the Holy Church of God, and we commit you to the secular arm. Take her to the place appointed for her execution, and let her be burned." On the morning of May 30th, Joan was brought to the old marketplace in Rouen, where a tall wooden platform had been constructed with a stake rising from its center. The platform was built higher than usual, high enough that the executioner would not be able to reach her quickly to strangle her or show mercy by hastening her death. She would have to burn, slowly, fully conscious, while thousands watched. As Joan approached the pyre, her composure finally shattered. She was 19 years old and about to be burned alive. She cried out in fear, asking for a crucifix. An English soldier in the crowd, moved by pity for the young girl about to die so horribly, snapped 2 sticks together to form a rough cross and handed it to her. Joan kissed it desperately and held it against her chest, tucking it into the white shift she wore. It was a gesture of pure humanity from an unexpected source, a common soldier showing more mercy than 42 learned clerics and judges who sat watching from their places of honor. But that makeshift cross was not enough for the moment Joan faced. A Dominican friar named Martin Ladvenu, one of the few members of the tribunal who had shown any compassion during the proceedings, ran to the nearby church and returned with a processional crucifix, a large cross mounted on a long pole. As the executioner led Joan up onto the platform, as they chained her to the stake, not loosely but tightly, so she could not fall or try to escape, so she would stand upright as she burned, Brother Ladvenu positioned himself as close as he dared and raised the crucifix high so Joan could see it. The executioner moved around the platform, checking the chains, arranging the bundles of wood and kindling. His name has not survived in the records, but his confession has. In later years, he would tell his family and anyone who would listen that he feared he was eternally damned for what he did that day, that he had sinned gravely in burning a saintly woman. After lighting the fire, he would have to be led away to a tavern where it took several strong drinks to calm his nerves. But on the morning of May 30th, 1431, he was still following orders. He lit the kindling at the base of the pyre. The fire started slowly, wisps of smoke, small flames licking at the dry wood. Then it began to roar, to crackle and hiss as it consumed the timber and climbed toward the platform where Joan stood chained. The heat became intense, unbearable. Smoke began to billow up, thick and choking. Through it all, witnesses reported, Joan kept her eyes fixed on the crucifix that Brother Ladvenu held above the flames. As the fire grew closer, as the heat became dangerous, even for those standing below, Joan called out to the friar, "Move away! Move away from the flame so you might not be hurt!" Even in her agony, she thought of others. What did Joan of Arc see in the flames the moment before she died? According to every witness account that survived, she saw the cross, not the flames, not the faces of the crowd, not the judges who had condemned her or the English commanders who had paid for her death. She fixed her eyes on the crucifix held high on its pole by Brother Ladvenu, and she did not look away. The cross became everything, her entire field of vision, her focus, her hope, her faith, made visible through the rising smoke and heat. As the flames rose higher, Joan's voice rang out over the marketplace, clear and strong despite the roar of the fire. "Rouen, Rouen, much do I fear you will suffer from my death," she cried, her words carrying across the thousands assembled to watch her die. It was not a curse but a prophecy born of sorrow, a warning that this judicial murder would bring consequences. Then the flames were all around her, and her words changed. "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" Over and over, witnesses heard her cry the name. Not once or twice, but repeatedly, like a prayer, like an anchor, like the only word that mattered as everything else was consumed. Some accounts say she called upon her saints, Catherine, Margaret, Michael, the voices who had guided her from the age of 13, who had promised she would save France, who had remained silent as the English soldiers captured her at Compiègne, and silent through the months of imprisonment and trial. But it was the name of Jesus that the crowd heard most clearly, rising above the hiss and crackle of the flames, above the weeping and crying of those watching who realized too late what they were witnessing. Joan died gazing at the cross, her eyes fixed on that symbol of suffering and redemption, calling the name of Jesus as smoke and flames engulfed her. Medical experts believe she died of smoke inhalation before the fire fully consumed her body, a small mercy in a merciless execution. But even after she lost consciousness, even after her voice fell silent, the flames continued their work. The English commanders determined that no relics of this dangerous woman should survive, that no shrine should mark where she fell, ordered the executioner to burn her remains a second time, and then a third, until nothing recognizable remained. What was left, ashes and fragments, was gathered and thrown into the river Seine so that nothing of Joan of Arc would remain in the earth. But they could not burn what people had seen. An English royal secretary named John Tressart, watching from among the English officials, could not contain himself as the flames died down. "We are lost," he blurted out to those around him. "We have burned a saint." Other witnesses reported similar reactions, soldiers weeping, members of the crowd openly lamenting, even some of the clerics who had condemned Joan showing visible distress at what they had done. The executioner himself, the man who had lit the fire and tended the flames, would spend the rest of his life haunted by the memory, convinced he was damned for killing a holy woman. In later years, as Joan's legend grew rather than faded, the executioner would make an extraordinary claim that when he sifted through the ashes to ensure everything had been consumed, he found Joan's heart intact among the remains, untouched by fire that had reduced everything else to ash. Whether this story was literal truth or metaphorical recognition of Joan's courage, it captured something essential, that what Joan represented could not be destroyed by flames, chains, or the judgment of corrupt men. The legal machinery that had condemned Joan began to unravel almost immediately. Charles VII, the king Joan had helped crown at Reims, finally bestirred himself to action once it was safe to do so. In 1456, 25 years after Joan's execution, a papal commission reviewed the case. They called 115 witnesses, men and women who had known Joan, soldiers who had fought beside her, citizens of Orléans who remembered the siege, even some who had been present at the trial. On July 7, 1456, the commission issued its verdict. Joan of Arc had been innocent. The trial of 1431 had been corrupt, politically motivated, and conducted in violation of canon law. The conviction was overturned. Joan was rehabilitated legally, but her transformation from condemned heretic to national symbol took centuries. In 1909, nearly 500 years after her death, she was beatified by the Catholic Church. In 1920, she was canonized as Saint Joan of Arc. The peasant girl burned as a heretic became one of the Church's most venerated saints. The voices she heard, which her executioners claimed came from demons, were officially recognized as divine. The visions that sent her to the stake became the foundation of her sanctity. What did Joan of Arc see in the flames the moment before she died? The historical record is unambiguous. She saw a cross. But perhaps the more profound question is what she chose to see, what she fixed her gaze upon when she could have been looking at anything else in those final moments. She did not watch the flames consuming her body. She did not stare at her executioners or judges. She did not scan the crowd looking for rescue that would not come or friendly faces that might comfort her. She chose to look at the symbol of Christ's suffering, the instrument of his execution, the cross that represented both the worst humanity could do and the promise of redemption beyond it. Brother Martin Ladvenu, the Dominican friar who held that cross aloft on its long pole, stood as close to the fire as he could bear, his arms surely aching from holding the heavy crucifix steady, smoke stinging his eyes, heat scorching his face. He held it there so that Joan would have something to anchor her vision, something to see through the flames and smoke, something to focus on besides her own agony. It was an act of extraordinary compassion in a moment designed to be utterly merciless. And Joan, to the very end, thinking of others even as she died, called out to him to move away from the flames so he would not be hurt. The cross Joan saw was not just wood and metal, not just a religious symbol. It was the visible expression of everything she had believed, everything she had fought for, everything that had sustained her through the voices that called her at 13, through the battles she won at 17, through the imprisonment and trial at 18 and 19. It was the promise that suffering had meaning, that injustice would not have the final word, that truth would ultimately prevail, even if she did not live to see it. She died gazing at that promise, calling the name of Jesus, her faith unbroken even as her body was consumed. 500 years later, the church that excommunicated her would declare her a saint. The nation whose king abandoned her to her enemies would make her its patron and symbol. The execution, meant to erase her memory, instead ensured she would never be forgotten. The ashes thrown into the sand to prevent veneration became the foundation of a legend that spread across centuries. The judges who condemned her are remembered only for their role in her martyrdom. The executioner who burned her spent his life repenting. The English officials who orchestrated her death are recalled only as villains in her story. But perhaps the most telling detail of all is this. An English soldier, one of the army that had captured her and demanded her death, could not watch a 19-year-old girl face the flames without something to hold. So he broke 2 sticks and made a cross and gave it to her. This girl who had led armies against him. This woman his commanders called a witch and a heretic. In that moment, that nameless English soldier saw past the propaganda and politics to a young woman about to die in terror, and he gave her what comfort he could. Joan kissed that rough wooden cross, held it to her heart, and carried it with her into the flames. What Joan of Arc saw in the flames was what she chose to see, the cross, held high by a compassionate friar who risked his own safety to give her something to fix her eyes upon. She saw the symbol of redemptive suffering, of faith that transcends injustice, of love that outlasts cruelty. She saw it clearly through the smoke and heat and terror, and she kept her eyes on it until consciousness left her, calling out, "Jesus!" until her voice was silenced by the flames that could burn her body but could not touch what she had seen, what she had believed, what she represented. The fire consumed her flesh, but not her legacy. The judges destroyed her life, but not her truth. The English paid 10,000 francs for a heretic and created a saint instead. The trial was never about heresy. It was about power, and in the end, a 19-year-old girl chained to a stake, gazing at a cross through the flames, wielded more of it than all the armies, courts, and kingdoms that tried to destroy her.